Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in our second webinar in the Democracy in Your Hands series. We're putting together this series to bring the work of the Democracy Truth Project in alignment with the League's recently launched Unite and Rise initiative. So today we'll be featuring some tools and resources on how to better understand media literacy, what to know, how to stay in the know, and how to engage yourselves and your leagues in this work. And I'm so thrilled to have as a co-partner in this series, Eric Schurenberg, the founder and CEO of the Alliance for Trusted Media. The Alliance is a partner of the League. We're so grateful to the work of the Alliance to build a more informed and free and accessible press. And without further ado, I'd like to share the screen with Eric now to get us started today. Thanks for being here, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Chelsey. And thanks to everyone for being here. This is a real pleasure and an honor to be associated with such a civically engaged and democratically informed organization as the League. So thank you, Chelsey, for the partnership. I am indeed the founder of the Alliance for Trust in Media. Before that, I was a journalist, a business journalist, and maybe even more reprehensible in today's economy, I was actually a media executive. My last role in commercial media was as the CEO of two business publications, Inc. and Fast Company. I left that role after January 6th, when I realized, maybe later than most of the people on this webinar, that this whole misinformation and living in separate realities thing was not a joke anymore, and that it had the potential to undermine our democracy and damage the country that I hold dear. And it seemed to me pretty obvious that someone in my position, in my profession of journalism, ought to do something about it. And so that's why I created the Alliance for Trust in Media. One of the things the Alliance does is help adults navigate this chaotic information environment and navigate their way to the best possible approximation of the truth at any given moment. So you can call that media literacy, as we do here. You can call it critical thinking skills or healthy skepticism, or as I call it, getting to be foolproof. Stone, the next slide, please. So the way to get to foolproof, in my mind, has two parts. The first is to understand what's going on in today's information ecosystem. Why does the news get made the way it is, and why does it come to us in the form that it does? And when you understand that, you can better do the second part of our goal today, which is to acquire the tactics and tools and attitudes that will guide you to the truth amid a totally chaotic information environment. Stone? Let's start by agreeing on a couple of assumptions. Let's stipulate, for example, that there is such a thing as objective truth. Not your truth and my truth, not red truth and blue truth, just objective facts that describe reality. As the astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson says, the beautiful thing about facts is they're true, even if you don't believe them. Secondly, let's accept that you need help to find your way through this information environment. You need sources that you can trust. It's the only way through this thicket of conflicting and chaotic information. And part of being media literacy, a large part of it, is identifying those sources you can trust. And finally, it's worth the effort. Yeah, this is a lot harder to find your way to truth in this information environment. I admit that, but it's worth the effort. When you're media literate, you will be a better parent. You will be a more informed consumer of news. You will be a better, more informed citizen. You will be impossible to manipulate. You'll be foolproof. So let's get into it. Stone? Whatever you think of when you think of the media environment, whether you're thinking about, the New York Times and the BBC or Breitbart and Joe Rogan podcasts or the Facebook posts from your crazy uncle. The media environment is all of that and much, much more. It is a chaotic hairball of conflicting information that is impossible to parse without help. No wonder many people say it's impossible to know what's true these days. But it's helpful to get your arms around this ecosystem, to divide it like you would any marketplace, into a supply side, which includes all the people who create content and distribute it, and the demand side, which is all of us, those who consume news. Next slide. So let's start with the supply side. So the supply side of an ideal news ecosystem would look like this, like a friendly neighborhood library where when you walked through the doors, you could be sure that the information would be laid out in an organized way, that you would be able to find the information that you sought. And if you had any trouble, well, there would be a friendly librarian there who would help you find what you wanted. And you could trust her because you knew that her only goal was to help you leave the library smarter than when you went in. Unfortunately, that's not what we have. What we have is this, Stone. This is what it looks like when you log onto the internet, when you walk onto the metaphorical library of, of today's information ecosystem. Instead of an orderly array of books, you are assaulted by a blizzard of random independent pages. You have no idea what the context is. You have no idea whether what's on any individual page is true or not. And there's no librarian to help you. Instead, there's just a machine who isn't particularly concerned about whether you get the information you want and come out smarter. All the machine cares about is making sure that you pick one page after another in an addictive way. Next slide. So let's take a closer look at this information ecosystem. And for those people who, when they talk about the media, mean legacy media, let's compare legacy media with a social media platform. So the New York Times, kind of the avatar of legacy media, a successful company as a business and a robust newsroom. It has 110 million monthly users. It's great. Its robust newsroom puts out 200 original stories a day. Kind of amazing. Until you compare it to YouTube, where 2.6 million videos are uploaded every day. 2.6 million every day. And the number of users is not 110 million, it's 2.7 billion, or about a third of the world's population. So when you think about the media environment, what you're really thinking about is not so much those legacy news providers that comprised the media 20 years ago. It's a social media world now. Stone? To understand how the supply side of the news ecosystem works, it's important to point out what the incentives are for the people who are creating and distributing the news. And that's just another way of saying, how do you make money in this new ecosystem? Stone? Well, largely the money is made in advertising. So let's take an example. It doesn't probably operate how you think. So let's say you're on YouTube, you see a video listed on the side that you want to play. And so you click on that link and up pops an ad for an Apple Watch. Now, you might assume, reasonably enough, that Apple made a deal with YouTube to run a video advertising their Apple Watch. But that's almost certainly not what happened. What happened is when you clicked on that link, a signal went to a technology company called an ad exchange. And the message from that to that tech company was, someone who meets your demographic is about to look at an ad. What am I bid for that person's attention? And so a bunch of advertisers put in a bid for your attention. In this example, Apple wins. So the Apple video is fed through another pipeline and pops up on your YouTube right before you see the video you want to watch. This happens in the blink of an eye. You're probably not aware of it, but it has profound implications for how the supply side of the news ecosystem works. On to the next slide, Stone. So what this new business model means is a couple of things. First of all, advertising brands don't control where their ads appear. So they're not looking for a brand or a publisher that reflects well on their brand. They don't care. They're only looking for the individual person that they can serve an ad to. So Apple doesn't necessarily know whether its watch ad appeared on a YouTube video about cooking or a conspiracy website or an ISIS recruiting site. And many brands don't even care. What it also means is that the advertising dollars don't flow to the platforms of the publishers with the best reputation for trustworthy news. Instead, they just go to the place where there's the best targeting, where they can find the exact kind of person that they're trying to sell, whatever they're trying to sell to. And that increasingly means exclusively social media platforms because they have the most data about you. In this world, advertising success is financial success, and financial success boils down not bring great news, but to grabbing attention. And grabbing attention is all about mastering the algorithms that guide the social media platforms. And those algorithms are geared not to delivering the truth, but to keeping you on the platform so the platform can sell you more ads. Next slide. In an environment where anyone can create content as long as they have an iPhone in their pocket and an account with YouTube or Facebook or X, who needs reporters? Who needs editors? And in an environment where machines determine who sees what, who needs the gatekeepers who make sure that the information is truthful? So what we have is a cataclysmic decline in traditional media. Next slide, Sloan. This depressing graph shows what happened to the newspaper industry over the past couple of decades. You see that about 16 years ago, revenue from advertising and circulation peaked for the newspaper industry. Since then, it has been in free fall and has declined literally 80%. 80% for newspapers. Next slide. In addition to the slide in the business prospects of legacy media, we've seen a real concentration in a few social media companies because of this new advertising environment. 5 of every 8 digital dollars goes to just 4 companies. Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram, Alphabet, which is Google Search and YouTube, Amazon, and TikTok. Hardest hit in this environment are local newsrooms. We've lost more than 3,000 of them over the past 15 years. We're losing them even today at the rate of 2 local newsrooms every week. And even in the newsrooms that haven't closed, the newsroom and the reporting staff and the editorial staff have been hollowed out. The number of reporter jobs and columnist jobs, correspondent jobs in newsrooms has declined by more than half in the past 15 years. So what does this mean for the news that appears in your newsfeed? Stone? What has this new business model wrought in the state of the news ecosystem? Next slide. Well, what you've probably noticed is your newsfeed is filled with more opinion and less factual reporting. It's a lot easier to pay someone to comment on the news that someone else generates than to send a reporter to Ukraine or Gaza or to Albany or to Richmond or the State House. So most of your newsfeed is not news, actually. It's commentary on the news made by someone like Jesse Waters there from Fox News, or it's opinion, someone trying to get you to adopt their point of view about the news, or it's analysis, attempting to put the news in a particular context, or it's a meme, which is nothing more than kind of an emotional outburst designed to show loyalty to a tribe or to mock the other side. Where news is still created, where original information is still shared, Most of it comes from traditional legacy journalism, mainly newspapers. Next slide. Another thing you'll notice about your newsfeed these days that it contains more heat and less light. So in an attention economy, what is it that gathers attention? It's high emotion. It's outrage. It's anger. It's fear. This is what drives attention and which drives advertising dollars. And the social media algorithms that tend to control what we see intensify this factor. And it's usually not an accident. As you can see from the headline of this Washington Post story about Facebook, Facebook's internal documents showed that Facebook puts 5 times as much weight on stories that trigger rage and misinformation than they do on mere likes. Next slide. Another thing you might notice about your newsfeed is that it contains more propaganda. The global ecosystem is not just confined to the US. It includes a number of content creators in other countries. Some of those countries don't necessarily have our best interests at heart, countries like China or Iran, and most especially the absolute masters of online propaganda, the Russians. So what we're about to show is an NBC News report by the excellent misinformation reporter, Brandy Zadrozhny, about one particular kind of Russian propaganda. Stone, if you can play that video.
Late last year, this strange, and let's just say from the outset, false story started going around about Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky.
Ukrainian President Zelensky somehow managed to buy 2 multi-million-dollar yachts.
Now, to be clear, nothing about the U.S. aid for yacht story was true. What was true? Vladimir Zelensky is the president of Ukraine. That checks out. And there is an ongoing debate about U.S. financial support for Ukraine. But there are a lot of these phony stories. NBC News has followed more than 40 over the last year. Clint Watts is an NBC News contributor. You've likely seen him in our coverage when there's big breaking stories. He's also the head of Microsoft's Threat Intelligence Center. Stories like these, Clint says, come straight through a pipeline, straight from Moscow, via something called Storm 1516.
Storm 1516 is what you would think of for the old troll farm, the Internet Research Agency, 10 years later, in that they need to adapt to a new medium, which is video, and they need to come up with a way to make disinformation.
Think of Storm 1516 almost like a disinformation production company. They follow a reliable path, one that starts with a cheaply made video.
Hey guys, my name is Olesya, and I'm a former employee of the so-called Troll Fabric.
I'm a senior associate scientist at a Pfizer facility in Kiev.
My name is Shahzad Nasser. I'm here to share an interesting discovery of mine.
The videos usually don't stay online long. They don't have to. They are just the kernels of so-called evidence in the pipeline.
According to this agreement I have managed to acquire, the yacht was referred to as Zelensky's yacht.
In this video, this isn't an actual journalist. His bio is faked, his true identity unknown. But his story is repackaged and amplified through the next part of the disinformation pipeline.
They then take those videos and they launder it through Telegram.
Telegram is a social media site popular with people kind of on the fringe,
But also through a series of websites that are made to look like local news sites.
The stories on those sites are shared on social media, first by known Russian propagandists, but then, if the plan works, by a U.S. audience. In this case, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene sharing the story with her 3.7 million followers. Her office didn't respond to our multiple requests for comment. The pipeline that began in Russia, now practically flooding American voters with disinformation. And here's the thing, these videos that kick it all off, they're not even that sophisticated. Darren Linville, director of Clemson's Media Forensics Hub, says they don't have to be.
More than half, I would say, almost completely fail. But it doesn't matter because they're so cheap to do that you only need a few of them to hit to make it entirely worthwhile. And they've had more than a few hits.
These videos are now targeting U.S. voters, trying to conflate fact and fiction and create havoc heading into the election.
So we can move on to the next slide. The point is that propaganda is not only coming from abroad. There are plenty of people seeking political power and political influence in the US who want to get you to accept particular political narratives. And the process they follow is not unlike what 1516 is doing in that NBC story. A false narrative is seeded on a remote part of the internet, and if it has any luck, it will get picked up by somebody with a lot more followers than common sense and will be shared into the mainstream. As you can imagine, there are people on both sides of the political aisle who are very interested in having you adopt their own propaganda from within. Some of those narratives that they want you to adopt, which prioritize and valorize their side and demonize the other side, are familiar to you. Let's go to the next slide. The research company Protagonist used AI to categorize hundreds of thousands of political posts from both conservative media and progressive media and categorize them into particular political narratives, strategic narratives, the Protagonist called it. So some of them you probably could already guess. On the conservative side, which by the way had many more news sites and a lot more content, that content funnels down to 4 basic narratives. The progressives are threatening our values. They promote chaos in their crime-ridden cities and their open borders, that they are part of conspiracies to undermine good Americans, and they don't understand how capitalism works with their socialist ways. On the progressive side, there is less content and it's more fragmented, but there are some recurring themes that the other side of the political aisle is authoritarian, that they undermine the Bill of Rights, that they are inept, and that they are all white supremacists. So what does this get us, this supply side of the information environment? And that's summed up in this chart. Next slide. This disheartening chart, I wish you could see it better, but it contains a lot of information, and I hope you look at it afterwards online, is a map of polarization in the US. And what these line graphs depict is what's called the perception gap. In other words, what Democrats think Republicans think on any particular issue versus what Republicans actually think on that issue, and then vice versa, what Republicans think Democrats think and what they actually think. For example, if you ask Republicans to comment on the following statement, that properly controlled immigration can be good for America, Democrats think that fewer than half of Republicans will agree. In fact, way more than 80% actually agree with that statement. And conversely, if you ask Democrats to comment on the statement that most police are good people, Republicans think that well fewer than half of Democrats will agree with that. And in fact, way more agree with it than the Republicans think. That's a percentage gap of 37 percentage points. So what does this mean? It means that when we valorize one side, when we imagine that our neighbors are more extreme when they are, when we demonize the way they think and the way they behave and don't want to associate with them, what we're demonizing are mirages, not real people. These are mirages that are created by an information ecosystem that is driven by machines, influenced by an attention economy, and that is only interested in polarization as a tool for profit. It leaves us less informed, less exposed to the truth, and more polarized than ever. So that disheartening moment sums up the supply side of the information environment. Let's go on to the demand side. So the supply side, remember, we described metaphorically as this library on which all these pages come flying at you and demanding your attention, and you can hardly sort out among them. The demand side is us news consumers walking into that chaotic library. And what determines whether we are media literate, whether we are being manipulated in this information environment, is which of those pages we pluck out of the air and what we do with the information on those pages. Next slide. If you're familiar with the work of the Nobel Prize economist Daniel Kahneman, then you're familiar with System 1 and System 2 thinking. It's fairly simple. System 1 is the frame of mind in which we spend most of our day. It is quick, intuitive, emotional, habitual. It allows us to make thousands of micro decisions over the course of the day without expending too much mental energy. System 1 is when you flip on the turn signal before you turn in your car or turn on the coffee in the morning. And when you read news, or watch a news video in System 1, and you're trying to decide whether it's true or not, you're likely to determine that it's true if it feels true. And what makes something feel true? Next slide. Kahneman and other psychologists have cataloged a whole series of mental shortcuts that allow us to operate in System 1 without expending a lot of energy. They're called heuristics. They're logical short circuits. One of them is negativity bias, which is our tendency to pay a lot more attention to news that scares us or seems threatening or dangerous than other kinds of news. Another is the illusory truth effect, a very simple but pernicious mental shortcut, which means that when a claim is repeated, it seems more true. Doesn't matter if the claim on the face of it is implausible. The more it's repeated, the more true it seems. Now, we could spend all day going through these, but I want to focus on just one more, which is confirmation bias and motivated reasoning, which is our tendency to seek out evidence that supports what we already believe and ignore evidence that doesn't. The journalist Barton Gellman decided for a story he was doing for The Atlantic that he would interview a January 6th insurrectionist and then take that person's beliefs one by one and refute them with real evidence and see if he could change that person's mind. The subject he chose was a congenial New York City fireman named Patterson. Patterson, among other beliefs, believed that the January 6th insurrectionists were accompanied by Army Special Forces in disguise. When asked where he got this information, Patterson pointed to a video on YouTube that had been made by a retired Army colonel. So Gellman called the colonel and asked him what evidence he had. And the colonel said, I happened to see in videos that there were a number of men who seemed to have the posture and demeanor of Army Special Forces. And some of them had bulges in their clothing that might conceal firearms. That was it. But there was more. After he got off the call with the colonel, he got a call from the colonel's son, who said, listen, I would really like it if you would not run the story of your conversation with my father. We've been trying to get my father not to share these ideas that he has. You see, my father has dementia. So Gellman takes the story back to Patterson and tells him, look, there's no real evidence for this belief of yours. Plus, the source of your belief is unreliable. He has dementia. And Patterson is unmoved. He says, that colonel is a patriot, and I'm going to believe any patriot before I believe a journalist like you. Now, the point of the story is not that Patterson is stupid or unusually gullible. All of us, when we're operating in System 1, are vulnerable to these logical short circuits that make us surprisingly easy to manipulate it. It's not a question of brains or healthy skepticism. It's just the way our brains are wired. And so the way to get out of this state is to switch from System 1 to System 2. Next slide. So System 2, as Kahneman relates it, is the thoughtful frame of mind. It's deliberative rather than reactive. It's open-minded rather than closed-minded. It's intellectually humble, which means It leaves you open to contrary evidence that challenges what you already believe. So when you're consuming news in system 2, you're likely to decide that something is true as long as it has solid evidence and only so long as that evidence holds up. So how do you get into system 2 when you're consuming news? I like to use a methodology that goes by the acronym of SIFT. It's quick. It allows you to make an informed decision about truthfulness or not in a very short time. The S in SIFT stands for stop. Understand the context of what you're looking at. I is for investigate the source. So find out whether there's political leanings in the source or whether there's an agenda that is not necessarily obvious. F is for find other coverage. If a story is important, it will be covered elsewhere and you can get another perspective on it. And if you're still not satisfied that you found your way to the truth, you can go to T, which is trace it back to the original source and see what the reporters are talking about. Let's dive deeper on the next slide. So stopping and understanding the context of the claim that you're reading is maybe the most important step. So figure out what it is you're actually looking at. Is this story news? Is it expanding knowledge? Is it introducing fresh reporting? Or is it just commentary on news that someone else has reported? Is it someone trying to put a particular spin on it with analysis, or to persuade you using opinion, or to excite your emotions with a meme? Figure out also the context around the story. Who might benefit from the story? Who has an interest in spinning the story that in the particular way it's spun? Also, on the next slide, you also importantly want to consider the context of you. So when you decided to click on that headline or click on that video, what were you really looking for? Were you looking for news that would expand your knowledge or deepen your understanding of a complicated issue? Or were you just looking for confirmation of what you already thought? Were you looking for an opportunity to score another one for us good guys? Look, there's nothing wrong with that. I do that all the time. We all do that. But it's just important to understand what it is you're doing and not imagine that you are necessarily broadening your knowledge. I is for investigate. Next slide. So you want to understand the orientation of the news source where you're finding this information. Does it have a particular political bias? Often you'll be able to determine that yourself from the wording in the headline or the wording in the story itself. But if you need help, there are a number of sites online that will tell you the political orientation of a particular news source. So one of them is called Media Bias Fact Check. Another is All Sides. Another is Ground News. There's Ad Fontes. All of these will be in the appendix at the end of this slide. So you can look at the end of this deck, you can look at it online after the webinar. One thing that is very useful to pay attention to when you're judging the veracity of the sources that are quoted in the story is what I call the friction cost. In other words, what is the price that this source would pay if what they're saying is not true or is mistaken? And conversely, what is the price that this source has already paid by bringing this information to light? So one example of the latter would be a whistleblower, like Frances Haugen, the whistleblower at Facebook, who downloaded thousands of pages from Facebook, including many internal research efforts that showed that Facebook was well aware of the harms that its algorithms and social media design were causing, and yet didn't really care. And another kind of friction cost is reputational cost. So if you're a reporter for the Wall Street Journal or the Atlantic or the New York Times, and you are making stories up, you will be fired. And your whole career may never recover from that. So I would say, when you're looking for the veracity of a particular story, give more weight to high friction costs that you perceive versus less. F is for find other sources. The next slide. So if a story really happened, it's going to be covered elsewhere. And I'd encourage you to look for other sources that are on the other side of the political aisle that will give a new perspective for you on the news story. So just see what the other side says. And if you want to see kind of a broad range of political takes on a story, you can go to news aggregators like allsides.com, Ground News, or Tangle. These sites gather news from across the political spectrum about a particular issue. And so you can see a lot of different perspectives about an issue in just one place. Next slide. And finally, if you're still not sure that you have gotten to the bottom of the story, you can trace it back to the origin. For example, if you're not sure what to make of the Supreme Court's decision about due process for deported immigrants, because Steve Miller in the administration says it means one thing, and the Democratic Senate leader, Chuck Schumer, says it means another thing, you can go directly to the source on the Supreme Court website and see what the decision actually, how the decision actually reads. If you're not sure about an image, you can use what's called reverse image search. It's very simple. Google will tell you how to do it. What you would find, for example, a lot of the images that appear about the Los Angeles protests, burning cars and chaos and confrontations, actually didn't happen in LA, that those images were images taken during protests in other places at other times, Paris or India, years ago. Now, I'd like to give you an example of putting the SIFT methodology in action over a story that I was very interested in earlier this year. So let's go to the next slide. The story I'm sure you're familiar with is the tragic plane crash over the Potomac, in which an American Airlines regional jet collided with an Army helicopter and 67 people died. I first encountered the story in this AP post, which seemed to me to be straight news. There was no analytical spin, certainly no opinion involved in it. Accidents are straight news, and this was legitimate coverage of it. I knew the AP had a reputation for going straight down the middle. Other coverage of the story confirmed what I found in AP. So it seemed like this was highly trustworthy. And then the next day, I saw this story. Next slide, Stone. This ran in the New York Times under this headline: Trump blames DEI and Biden for a crash that occurred under his watch. So at first glance, this might seem like news because it's reporting on something that the president said in a press conference, and that's newsworthy. But if you look at the subhead, you see that what the writer is doing is trying to put the president's statements in context of how this particular president acts after national tragedies like this and compare it to other presidents like Obama or Reagan or George W. Bush. Now, I know that the Times has a reputation for leaning left. After reading the story, I was pretty outraged that the president of the United States would take this tragic opportunity to push an ideological point of view. And furthermore, I was flabbergasted that the president would take such a highly unlikely explanation for this tragedy before there was even a shred of evidence about what caused the accident. But I was aware that the Times has a political leaning. I do too. And so to get the full story about this, I went to another source. Stone? That other source was the New York Post, which I knew leans hard right. And I found this story, which appeared under this headline: The FAA is embroiled in a lawsuit alleging it turned away 1,000 applicants based on race, and that contributed to staffing lows. Now, at first glance, knowing the orientation of the Post, I assumed that this was just an attempt to gin up some explanation that would make the president's statements seem less outlandish. But I decided to find some other coverage and test that hypothesis. And I found out that there was indeed such a lawsuit. I found it on an aviation website that had no political leanings called AviWeb. And now my curiosity was sparked, and I went back to the original complaint that the lawyers had filed in the lawsuit. And what I found was that there was indeed a period between 2014 and 2016 when the admissions for ATC controllers for the FAA did prioritize applicants of color over white applicants, that the application grading system had been modified. Now, did that mean that I believed that DEI caused the accident in the Potomac? Of course not. That's still ridiculous. Did it mean that I thought the president was right to bring up that explanation under the circumstances? Of course not. I still thought it was highly unpresidential and really disappointing. But it did show me that there was a kernel of a nugget of a grievance at the heart of this belief system. When journalists are actively trying to be a force of unity in their community rather than a force of division, they practice what's called complicating the narrative, with the observation that most stories are more complicated than they seem at first glance. So going through the SIFT methodology about this tragic accident complicated the narrative for me. And while it didn't change my mind, it did lower my anger and reduce my sense of polarization that I had after reading the New York Times story. So let's summarize what we have been discussing about how to be foolproof. Stone, the next slide. The most important thing you can do when you encounter a news story, especially one that triggers your emotions or confirms your political narrative, is to stop. Get out of system one and into system two. Don't just react. Think about what you're reading. Understand the source. Imagine what the creator's intent might be. Understand the political environment that might be the context around the story. And then investigate. Be alert to friction costs. Who stands to lose if the story is right? Who stands to gain if the story is true? And see what other outlets are saying, especially outlets that take a different point of view around the politics of the issue. Be open-minded, be actively open-minded, and seek other points of view, and be intellectually humble enough that when you encounter evidence that doesn't confirm your original beliefs, accept that evidence. If you do that, you will be a much smarter consumer of news. You will be a much better informed citizen, and you will be all but impossible for someone to manipulate online. You will, in fact, be foolproof. Thank you. And now let me just say that at the end of this deck, there are a number of resources that you can use that will help you find your way to the truth, that will help you find different points of view about a particular news story. I'll also have offered the news sources I use to challenge my particular points of view. So all of this will be on the deck, which we'll share afterwards. And now, Chelsey, back to you.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that wonderful, informative, and knowledge-based presentation. I think it's imperative that we know all the ins and outs of how to be better consumers of the news, and take that knowledge and share it within our families, our communities, and of course, in our leagues. So now I'd like for us to take part in a interactive activity here. We want to hear how your leagues are working on media literacy. Media literacy is so important in action. We want to know what you're doing to continue this work, whether it be trainings, whether it be roundtable discussions, webinars. I want to hear from you all. We're going to drop in the Q&A portion a link to Canva. When you go to that link, you'll be able to drop in what your league is doing to promote media literacy. So take some time here now, add in what you're doing, and then we'll talk through some of the ways in which you're working through media literacy in your league. I'll give us some time to do that, and we'll reconvene shortly. But looking forward to hearing from you all. And while you're adding in what your league is doing, if you have any questions for Eric or for I, please drop them in the Q&A portion of the town hall. We're looking forward to getting to those questions as well. I'll give it a few moments, and please do visit Canva and drop in what your league is doing to promote media literacy. We're going to actually populate the Canva now so we can see what folks are up to, and we'll walk through some of that together. Thanks for making this a collaborative and interactive session today, because of course, we want to see how leagues are taking action and what's resonating most with you all. And please do share this with others in your league. If there are others that are working specifically on media literacy, we'd love to hear about that, how to grow those efforts, and how we can continue to offer resources from LWVUS that speak to sustaining those efforts. So I'll share a few of the ways in which you all are working on media literacy. It looks like the Civic Rise organization is a 501c3 nonprofit that a league member is also a member of. And voters in as a league member in Los Angeles. Alameda County League. We developed a free fun-based game called Verify It. Yes, I do know of Verify It. Thank you so much for creating that resource, that tool that helps folks to navigate how to be more media literate, how to sustain those discernment skills and understanding how best to use that SIFT method when verifying information. Let's see. Lancaster County, PA is organizing its annual Kinderline lecture. The tentative speaker is Barbara McQuaid, and she wrote Attack from Within, How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. Great job out in Lancaster, PA. The Diablo Valley, California has a Fact Over Fiction, Navigating the News presentation that you'll share with the public. You've encouraged folks to join the Truth Brigade trainings through indivisible.org, and we'll now promote this series from LWVUS. So wonderful things happening. Please continue to share that link out. We'd love to hear from you all, and we'll share the link in the follow-up from this webinar as well. Now I'd like to open it up to any questions that we have. I will start with a few questions that we've identified from the chat. The first one is, I'm a librarian. I spent 2 years in library school and have worked in academic libraries for 10 years. Shout out to all librarians out there. Shameless plug, we do have a wonderful partnership with the American Library Association. The question also asks, I understand information, but the political polarization of our country means that a good amount of people have convinced that libraries themselves are not information literate. How can we change this narrative? I'll share that with you, Eric. What are your thoughts on how can we change the narrative that libraries are hubs of literacy?
That is such a difficult dilemma. But first of all, Chelsey, let me agree with you. I think librarians are heroes in this information environment. The problem that librarian user describes is a lot like local newsrooms problem, is that they're doing the best they can. They have standards. They understand how to get truthful information, and they understand the rules of evidence and so forth, and they don't get credit for it. What I have been encouraging the partners of the Alliance for Trust to do to build trust with their local audiences is to find ways in which they can contribute to the community that are not necessarily on reporting the news, or I guess in the case of a library, in helping people find information in the library. So things that support the community, like, around sports or around community history or things like that. As a matter of fact, we talked earlier about Lancaster, Pennsylvania. In Lancaster, the Alliance is working with a local newsroom called LNP, which is, and the thing we're working on is focusing the work of LNP in one section about the history of central Pennsylvania. And the idea is that this is something that all central Pennsylvanians share. We can emphasize in our coverage there about how division has split central Pennsylvanians apart in the past, and yet we always came together with an idea that we are all here in this together. And in that sense, you can, and to bring it back to the library, I think you can use kind of the same methodologies to focus people's attention on what the library does for the community as a way to build trust. That is not necessarily doing the direct functions of the library where people clearly have been misled. And the other thing I would say is don't be disheartened by people who have gone off the deep end. There are many people who just find conspiracy theories and identity politics so attractive that you will never be able to talk them out of it. But for a healthy democracy, we don't need to convince everybody about what reality is. We just need those people who are convincible, still in the middle, to understand the way we work and that our desire to bring factuality to the people we serve.
Absolutely. And I want to underscore just how important libraries are for promoting literacy, but also promoting civic identity. We know that libraries are hubs for different cultural groups and communities, different democracy groups and communities, for young people, for intergenerational convenings of people. So anything we can do to promote libraries as hubs of accessing information and really civic education hubs, I think is important we do that as well. The next question we have is in regard to legislation. An attendee asks, perhaps we should have legislation of what we can define as news versus what we consider to be entertainment or opinions. What's your take on that, Eric?
Journalism, unlike many other professions that you can imagine, like accountancy or law or even hairdressing, doesn't require any particular credentials or training. And that is a problem. There are many people who are describing themselves as independent journalists who don't subscribe to any particular journalistic standards, none that I would recognize. I think that it's a long shot to think that there would be legislation that would determine that. And you can imagine how, depending on who is in office, that kind of licensing could be abused. I would say that kind of for now and the foreseeable future, the responsibility for determining what is reliable information, what is reliable journalism, lies with all of us. That we have to practice things like SIFT and using our own common sense to find our way to the truth in this information environment. And I would also say that be careful not to define good journalism or trustworthy journalism by whether it agrees with your political stance. On one of the classes that I teach at the University of Chicago, the guest speaker was Jonah Goldberg of the conservative newsletter, The Dispatch. And he made the point that objective journalism, meaning, you believe what they say aligns with reality, may be easy to manipulate based on your political orientation. But honest journalism, someone who follows the truth as they see it, shows their evidence, is transparent about how they work, that knows no political boundaries. So look for those signs of honest journalism, even in places where you don't necessarily agree with the political orientation of the news source.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. We have another one that's particularly related to regulation of media. Um, do we know if there's any official effort to regulate media? That is some sort of system to rate the accuracy of a story. As a news consumer, it's very time consuming for most of us to vet news in this new internet age. So it is unlikely people will do it regularly since we're in this new information environment and age. There's a need for guardrails. What's your advice on how better to regulate with the rise in scope of scale of the information ecosystem?
Well, I would say that there are a couple things that you can do. Once you've identified trustworthy sources of news, you don't have to vet every single story. So that's one thing. And if you have a kind of array, a sort of lineup of sources that you trust, especially if you're going across the political spectrum, you don't have to do a whole lot of work to get to the bottom of a particular story. I mean, it's kind of a one and done thing. But if you want to get outside opinion on what is a trustworthy news source, there are a couple of online organizations that do rate the veracity of news organizations. We mentioned during the presentation All Sides and Ground News. Both of those news aggregators also offer judgment about whether those news sources are high or low in factuality. Organizations like NewsGuard and the Trust Project rate prominent news sources by their reliability. So you can find outside information. But I think that if I left the impression that you need to reconsider every news story, that would indeed be a burden. But if you can find the sources that you can trust and stick with them and make sure that you're not routing yourself into a ideological corner or living in a particular bubble, then I think you can do it once and then stick with those.
Wonderful. We've got two more questions here. How do we ask for better quality reporting from our local-ish news publications? For example, our local news covered the No Kings Day protest with a sensationalist bend, using images from late night agitators, heavy police presence, and missed the overall story of 20,000 peaceful families and activists that gathered together. We're planning to send in an op-ed, but this kind of thing happens a lot. Events get ignored or they are reported on, or when they're reported on, much of the time it's inaccurate. And then people don't subscribe or purchase that paper. Finding that Google News feeds links and some of the things I'm following and so on into a paywall, you're met with a paywall. Some members can't afford to subscribe to everything. How can we get better at investigating without paying for it?
That's a complicated question. And unfortunately, it does look like the world is dividing itself into paywalled quality journalism and low quality journalism for free. And that would be highly regrettable. When it comes to local news and how to make the news coverage better, it sounds like in this particular instance, the user is talking about a news site that has a very slanted political point of view. And one thing to be aware of is that, as you may have heard Clint Watts in the NBC video say, there are a number, literally hundreds, of fake local news sites around the US that are masquerading as legitimate local news sites, but really just parrot one political side's talking points. So they all have names that make them seem like legitimate news. Where I used to live in California in Contra Costa County, the Contra Costa Times is one of these fake sites. There are no reporters. They are fed their news by, according to a right-wing news generation machine, and you can't rely on them. In the case of the local paper that's described here, if it's not one of those fake sites, which are also known as pink slime sites, then it sounds like the owners of that paper have decided, for reasons of their own political orientation or their decision about what their audience wants, to be right-leaning. All I can say is look for somewhere else for your news source or start up a rival. There are probably other people in your community who feel differently about the angle they should take on the news.
Thank you very much. And our final question for today, the challenge is, how do we get folks who are not inclined to use system 2 line of thinking? It requires critical thinking skills, which unfortunately do not seem to be valued much today. What suggestions do you have to try to reach others who may not be inclined to use system 2 to do so?
I think it's not your responsibility to get other people to use system 2 when they read the news, especially if what is underlying that idea is that people should agree with you about politics. But I would say that when you use system 2 to consume the news, you're likely to see that the narratives are more complicated than you might have expected at first. And if you go through the world that way, you're going to have, just kind of by the nature of it, more empathy for people across the political aisle. And then this is a slow process, but then you have a much better chance of understanding people who are reflexive about their news, who tend to be easily manipulated and tend to have different political points of view. And you can, by understanding where they're coming from, even if you don't agree with it, by listening to them, you can slowly convert them to at least accepting your point of view. I think that this is generational work, that we have so allowed the machinery, the social media platforms, the political atmosphere to so pollute our information environment. It's going to take a generation for us to work out of it. But the work starts with each of us. As this whole process is called, democracy is in our hands. And if we work hard ourselves, step by step, we're going to pull ourselves out of this polarization hole. That's what I believe.
Thank you so much. A great way and a great message to end on. We've got to keep our resolve. We've got to know that when we center integrity and when we center the facts, we can be part of defending our democracy more boldly and with so much purpose. So I want to thank Eric for being here with us today. Truly remarkable work at the Alliance for Trust in Media. I want to thank all of you for being part of this amazing conversation today. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for being part of the activity on Canva. We will be sharing a recording of this briefing along with the resource guides, particularly. We look forward to having you join for additional sessions of the Democracy in Your Hands series. The next webinar will be on Wednesday, July 23rd. That will feature championing issues that matter. So we'll have a wonderful conversation in store about how to tap in to the personal being political and unearthing those interests that matter to you, that drive your league work. So again, thank you all for being here and wishing you a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Chelsey. Thank you, Stone.
Yes, really thank you so much, Stone. Bye-bye.
Bye all.